Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to this week's Q&A. As always, thank you so much for your questions. And also, as always, if I don't answer your question in this video, then go ahead and copy and paste it onto the bottom of this Patreon post. And also post any new questions that you have. And also, please don't forget to like all the questions that you want answered, because I generally answer the questions in order of how many likes they have. So let's jump right in. Lamont asks, hey Matt, so with you potentially dabbling in another language, now might be a good time to ask, how do you feel about the inherent contradiction of building up tolerance for ambiguity and doing difficult things in general? But while you're doing that, you'll also be getting good enough at a language that you no longer find very much ambiguity in it. E.g., I haven't watched or read something that I didn't understand most of in almost a year now. So if I were to start immersing in a new language now, it would probably be a big shock to my system, since any language that I would watch things in now are at a very comfortable high level of comprehension. I wonder if this was part of your difficulty with Chinese, along with other pressures that you've spoken about. Because you became used to understanding Japanese and English and possibly forgot the skill of being okay with low comprehension. So yeah, this is a really interesting question/point that I hadn't really thought of before, but the way that I think about it is that the ability to tolerate ambiguity is really important for the beginner and intermediate stages of learning a language, because it's inevitable that you're going to come across lots of things that you don't understand, and so you need to be able to deal with that. But as you get to more advanced levels of fluency, then of course there's going to be less and less ambiguity that you experience. And so I do think that most people are probably going to experience that. If we were going to basically map out on one axis tolerance to ambiguity and another axis time in learning a language, or you could also just map it as ability in a foreign language, as someone gets better and better at a foreign language, probably their ability to tolerate ambiguity is going to continue to increase, and then somewhere it's going to hit some peak, and then it's probably going to start actually declining, because as they reach a really high level in their target language, the necessity to tolerate ambiguity will start to decline, and so their ability to tolerate ambiguity will probably atrophy a little bit. But that's not inherently a problem, because the only reason you need to be able to tolerate ambiguity is because there's going to be a lot of ambiguity to tolerate. So if your ability to tolerate ambiguity is declining because there isn't enough ambiguity for you to train your tolerance on, then by definition, that's totally fine, and you don't actually need to be able to tolerate ambiguity to the same level. So I would say that, yeah, probably it is true that as you get to an advanced level, you're going to find that your ability to tolerate ambiguity actually starts to atrophy. But I think that's totally fine, and it's actually atrophying because you have ceased to need it as much. Now, I also agree that, yeah, when if you're doing this style of language learning where you're learning one language at a time and you're getting to a very high level in one language before you move on to the next, I do think that when you start learning a new language, it is going to be a shock to your system, because your ability to tolerate ambiguity is going to have atrophied significantly. And so you're going to have to spend some time building it back up. But I think that once you've developed the ability to tolerate ambiguity one time, then kind of bringing it back or retraining it future times is going to be a lot quicker and a lot easier. And I also think that one of the biggest reasons why it's difficult to tolerate ambiguity in the beginning of, when you're learning your very first language, is because although you might have an intellectual understanding of the input hypothesis and how language acquisition happens, it's not really going to make intuitive sense until you've experienced it yourself. And until that happens, there's always going to be part of your mind that feels like, is this really a good use of my time, or is this whole thing just bullshit and I'm just wasting my time? And it's that thought in the back of your head, that doubt, that I think makes it a lot more difficult to tolerate ambiguity. And so once you've learned at least one language to fluency, then you know for sure that the method works. And so that's naturally going to make it easier to tolerate ambiguity, because you don't have that doubt anymore. Although it will still probably be difficult at the beginning when you first start a new language, and you probably still will have to go through a period of building up that tolerance to ambiguity again. And when I was learning Chinese, actually I have been learning Chinese recently, I guess to go on a small tangent, I tried to learn Spanish for a couple weeks. That was what I talked about in the last Q&A. But what it made me realize is that I really want to learn Chinese. Like, Chinese is the language besides Japanese that I really do have true intrinsic interest in, and that I naturally want to learn. And so I decided to just go back to Chinese and continue learning it and not worry too much about how far I'm going to take it, or how quickly I'm improving, and just spend some time on it every day and try to enjoy the time that I put in. But anyway, in my experience with Chinese in the past and in the recent weeks, I think, well, the reason why I've struggled with it historically is partially to do with that my tolerance to ambiguity has declined, but more than that, and I've talked about this before, I think the reason why I struggled with Chinese was because I had the first-hand knowledge of just how long it takes to get to a decent level in a foreign language that's as difficult as Japanese or Chinese. And because I had that first-hand knowledge of just how long I was going to suck and just how slow my improvement was going to be given how much time I was investing, that itself became very discouraging. Whereas when I was learning Japanese, well, first of all, I was spending like 6+ hours on it every single day, so I was making pretty significant progress, so that itself made it motivating. But the other thing was that I didn't know how long of a journey learning Japanese was going to be. I thought it was going to be maybe 18 months, 2 years at the most, and then I was going to be fluent, and I would have, I'd have the game beat, and that was going to be it. And so it was easy to get really excited and really motivated about learning Japanese when I thought that, just around the corner, there was going to be a version of me that was basically native level in Japanese. Whereas now with Chinese, I can see that it's going to be like, okay, at this level of time commitment, just 1 or 2 hours a day, it might be years until I'm only somewhat decent, and even at that time, I'm still going to largely suck. And so that itself was very discouraging, and I think it was that more than the tolerance of ambiguity. But I think the tolerance of ambiguity was still part of it. And one last point that I just want to make on this topic is that, of course, once you reach an extremely high level of fluency, then your need to tolerate ambiguity is probably going to completely stop existing. Like you probably will get to a point where there is zero ambiguity for you to tolerate, or at least very close to zero. But I would say there's probably going to be a long period where you're quite advanced, quite fluent in your target language, yet there still is some necessity to tolerate ambiguity. For example, one of the things that you're going to be doing in stage 4 in the new roadmap is tackling new domains in the language that you don't yet have a strong grasp in. And there's going to be tons of domains that you're going to want to tackle in order to really reach a kind of native-like level of comprehensive fluency. And at a very advanced level, it can be easy to kind of get complacent with the domains that you're already comfortable in and not take the initiative to leave your comfort zone and go and spend time in domains that you don't understand yet. And it can be challenging at that high level to have the diligence to go and do that, because once you have a couple domains that you're pretty comfortable in, then you start to kind of get this ego associated with your ability in the language, and you start to feel like, oh no, I'm pretty good at this thing. And so then whenever you go and try to start working on a new domain, then it's like a slap in the face, because suddenly you're not so good at your target language anymore, and then that's a big hit to your ego. So I think that even at a pretty high level, there's still going to be, you still got to be cultivating that tolerance to ambiguity, because if you're actively going and seeking out new domains in the language, then until you reach a really extremely high level of fluency, there still is going to be ambiguity that you need to tolerate. So Alex Smith asks, in your Patreon video, The Pitch Accent Problem, you mentioned that you wanted to do more research into the subject of pitch accent acquisition. For example, you mentioned that certain parameters need to be flipped for native speakers of non-pitch accent languages to fully acquire Japanese pitch accent. Did you ever research into the subject more thoroughly? Do you still think that studying pitch accent and having knowledge of pitch accent patterns, etc., is enough for somebody to output naturally with correct pitch accent? Also, do you believe there is a way to flip these parameters to allow us to acquire pitch accent? So yeah, it's been probably close to 2 years since I made that video, The Pitch Accent Problem, and I believe that video is still up on Patreon. So I'm gonna answer this question assuming that whoever's listening to this has already seen that video, because that video is like an hour long and I cover a lot of content in there. So I don't think I'm gonna be able to, re-explain all of my ideas in this Q&A, or it would get way too long. So if the answer I'm about to give doesn't fully make sense and you want to understand what I'm saying more deeply, then go and watch that pitch accent problem video. I'll link it in the description. So yeah, my thoughts on this topic have changed somewhat significantly since I made that video. So to basically just explain where I'm at now with it. So one So I think if you take Stephen Krashen's basic model of how language acquisition works, which is that there's language acquisition and then there's language learning. Acquisition is an unconscious process, and what you've acquired you're able to use naturally, and then what you've learned functions as just conscious knowledge in your that state that you can consciously recall and think about. And the way that you use your conscious knowledge is in the form of a monitor. So Stephen Krashen has this idea of a monitor where basically when you're speaking a foreign language, what happens first is a foreign language thought pops into your head based off of what you've acquired. Then you can either just say that, or you can use the conscious knowledge that you've memorized to kind of analyze the thought that popped into your head and then make any corrections that need to be made to it. And so in the form of pitch accent, what this might look like is I want to say something in Japanese, a thought pops into my head in Japanese, and then before I say it, I use conscious knowledge to kind of analyze the pitch I was going to say it with and make sure that it's accurate. And if it's not, then I can like shift it. And so it's this two-step process. First, you have what you've acquired popping into your mind, and then you have the conscious fiddling you do to apply the conscious rules, and then you can say it. And so basically, I think that, of course, the ideal is that you're able to speak with correct pitch accent without using a monitor, without having to apply any conscious knowledge. The Japanese that pops into your head the first time comes with correct pitch accent, and when you speak, it comes out the right way, and there's no thinking about pitch accent happening. And of course, this is what it's like for native speakers of Japanese to speak the Japanese language. And so when we say, is it possible to fully acquire pitch accent, we mean, is it possible to get to that point where when you just speak Japanese without doing any conscious thinking about anything, it comes out with the right pitch accent. You fully embodied it. You have an intuitive understanding of what the language is supposed to sound like that includes pitch accent. And so I think in that video, I came up with some hypothesis that if you learned Chinese before Japanese, then that would flip some parameter in your mind that would make it so that you could acquire pitch accent. I don't really think that this is true because basically I had this hypothesis in that original video that because pitch accent was necessary in Chinese, when a speaker of English, for example, acquires Chinese, their brain is forced to become aware of how tones work in Chinese because the tones are so crucial to the language. And then once that parameter is flipped, then when they come to Japanese, because their brain will already know that there is such thing as connections between lexical meaning and pitch, that they'll be able to naturally acquire pitch accent. But it turns out that there's actually a lot of Chinese learners who just ignore tones from the beginning, or who just always ignore tones. They start off learning Chinese, they don't care about the tones, and they never care about the tones. And when they get to the point where they've acquired a decent amount of the language and they're starting to output naturally, they actually totally butchered the tones. So I didn't know this at the time, but I have learned that now it's not so uncommon for Chinese learners to just butcher the tones, even though they have become able to understand Chinese. So I guess that even though, the role that tones play in Chinese is so great, you can still heavily rely on context and not learn to rely on the tones as much as a native speaker would when determining, what words you're hearing when you're listening to the spoken language. And so it seems like, in a way, Chinese learners face a similar problem as Japanese learners do. If they don't put in any work, then by default, they're probably not going to pick up the tones. Maybe some will who have a really good musical ear or something, but it seems like it's not an uncommon thing for Chinese learners, for basically people who speak Western languages, to learn Chinese and not pay attention to the tones and then not acquire the tones. Now, it does seem in Chinese that people who pay attention to the tones are able to acquire it. And so that kind of brings me to where I'm at currently, which is I think that when you first start learning either Japanese or Chinese as a Westerner, you're not going to be able to hear the tones or pitch accent. You can hear two words pronounced with different tones, but everything else about them are the same. And you might notice that something sounds a little different, but you can't really pinpoint what it is. And I know that, I can't speak as much for Chinese, but I know that for Japanese, there's even learners who are pretty advanced and they still can't properly hear pitch accent. When they try to listen for pitch accent, they pick up on stress accent instead, which doesn't align with pitch accent. So that's the starting point of Western people who try to learn Japanese or Chinese. But by learning about tones or learning about pitch accent and then consciously trying to hear them, you can train your perception and become able to hear it. So for example, when I first learned about pitch accent in Japanese, I learned, okay, there's these 4 patterns. Each pattern roughly sounds like this. And then these words belong to this pattern, and then these other words belong to this pattern. So I had that level of knowledge. And then when I listened to Japanese, I would try to hear the pitch accent, and I would hear a word pronounced, and I would know, okay, so this word is supposed to be a tamadaka. Let me hear if it actually, fits the pattern that I read about. And so I would be trying to perceive it. And through this, I created a deliberate feedback loop where I had a task that I was trying to do, which is perceive pitch accent. And then I was immediately able to give myself feedback. Did I perceive the pitch accent or not? Because I had the knowledge of what it was supposed to sound like. So I was able to use that knowledge to give myself feedback as to whether I perceived it correctly or not. And through doing this, just trying to hear the pitch accent and then giving myself the feedback of whether I succeeded or not, I became able to hear the different pitch accent patterns better and better and better. And it eventually got to the point where they were so crystal clear to me that it became mind-blowing that other Japanese learners are able to just ignore them in a way. Now, of course, it just seems like that because anytime you master a skill, it becomes so obvious to you that it's hard to imagine not being able to do that skill. So it's not that pitch accent is necessarily obvious or easy. It's just that once you master it, it appears to be that way. And so I got to that point with Japanese. And so now I hear pitch accent. I hear something that I didn't hear before. It's literally like I was deaf before in this one particular aspect, and now I can hear. So what my sense is when I'm listening to Japanese and I'm not even listening for pitch accent consciously, I'm just trying to say, okay, let me listen to what Japanese sounds like. And I'm not overlaying any conscious models of like, okay, there's these 4 patterns and this word is this pattern, but when it's conjugated in this form, then it becomes like this. That's all conscious knowledge, right? That's a mental model that I've developed consciously. And it's, that conscious mental model is not comprehensible to my unconscious language acquisition device. So I actually think that, sorry, I'm kind of all over the place, but I haven't talked about these ideas before. So I actually think that perhaps when you're listening to Japanese and you're consciously trying to interpret the Japanese in terms of a conscious model of pitch accent, you're actually getting in the way of your unconscious mind acquiring pitch accent. But the thing is, you have to go through a period of using a conscious model to develop the ability to hear pitch accent in the first place. So what I think happens is, at first, you can't hear pitch accent. Then you use a conscious understanding of pitch accent to go through a deliberate practice process where you train yourself to hear it. Then once you can hear it directly, it's like part of your perception, you actually drop all the conscious knowledge about it and you just listen to it directly and you just hear what it sounds like. And if you just listen to what it sounds like in a direct way without overlaying conscious models or thoughts, then I think that your unconscious mind is now accessing new data that it wasn't accessing before. And through that, it might actually acquire pitch accent for you. And so my sense is that I have partially acquired pitch accent, but not all the way. And I think I think the biggest reason is that I just haven't gotten that much immersion in the past few years since I trained the ability to hear pitch accent. Like I pretty much stopped living my all Japanese all the time lifestyle right after I became able to hear pitch accent really, really well. And so I have had minimal immersion in the time since then. And so I just think there hasn't been enough. I haven't fed my unconscious mind enough raw Japanese for it to fully acquire pitch accent. Now that it's actually receiving the pitch accent info because I trained my perception to hear it. So my sense is that if I, for example, moved to Japan and started listening to Japanese for many hours every day again, but didn't necessarily, and maybe paid attention to how Japanese sounds, but not breaking it down or analyzing it with a conscious model of pitch accent, just trying to hear it directly as if it was just a melody of a song, then I think I would be able to acquire more and more of it over time. And so that's kind of how I think about it now, is that it's not necessarily about flipping a parameter. I think it's more like you just have to get the data to your brain, and then your brain will slowly kind of figure it out. But by default, your brain's not gonna learn to hear it if you don't train the ability to hear it. And two other things that I kind of just want to touch on this topic is that when I speak Japanese, I do apply a filter pretty significantly, a monitor related to pitch accent. So while I'm speaking, I do have some kind of subroutines installed where the what I want to say pops into my mind from my unconscious, and then I kind of make sure that I'm about to pronounce it with the right pitch right as it comes out of my mouth. And it's a very quick, minimalistic process. It's not like I'm consciously going, okay, this word is a tamadaka, and so it's going to drop after this mora. And it's not like that. It's just like in my mind, as soon as I decide that I want to say a word, I know what pitch accent pattern that word is, and I make sure I say it with that pattern. So it's a very direct thing, but it still takes a little bit of extra conscious processing. And so basically when I'm expressing a complicated thought in Japanese and all my conscious mental bandwidth is going to just deciding what I want to say, then my pitch accent accuracy will drop because my monitor stops activating, and now I'm relying solely on what I've unconsciously acquired. And when that happens, like when I watch recordings of myself back, like actually the other day I filmed an interview with Yoko, who someone actually mentioned, like I learned about Yoko in a Q&A. Someone said, hey, check out this person. She's Japanese, and in Japanese she talks about immersion learning. So I was interviewed for her channel in Japanese, and so I'm explaining my history of how I learned Japanese and my ideas on language acquisition, all in Japanese. And so that totally just took up all my mental bandwidth, and I didn't have enough like processing power left to consciously change the pitch accent. And so my pitch accent accuracy is not amazing, but it's still significantly better than it was. And for example, my like self-introduction video that I made 3-4 years ago before I really learned how to fully hear pitch accent. And so that's why I say I've half acquired it, is when you look at me with no monitor, then I have significantly higher accuracy than I did before I studied pitch accent at all, but it's still not all the way there. I still make a decent number of mistakes. And when I listen to the recording back, a lot of the mistakes actually sound like mistakes to me. That's like another sign that I've like at least partially acquired it to a significant degree. Like it will just sound wrong, yet that's how it came out when I said it. So there might also be an aspect to it where I haven't practiced speaking enough, and if I practice speaking more, then I would be able to better embody what I have acquired of pitch accent, and my accuracy would improve. But basically where I'm at now is that if I'm in a situation where I can fully use my monitor, I can speak with like 99% pitch accent accuracy. So like, for example, when I filmed the introduction to the why you should learn Japanese from anime video, well, I already knew roughly what I was going to say, and I filmed it a couple times, and so I was able to speak with perfect pitch accent accuracy, I think, in that intro. But when I'm just on the spot, I'm not able to do it at that level of accuracy. But even when I'm in a conversation, a lot of times you're only saying one or two sentences at a time, and then you're waiting for the other, and well, not waiting, but you'll in most conversations you're only saying one or two sentences at a time, and then you stop and let the other person respond. And so it's not hard to apply the monitor to just 2 sentences. And so even in spontaneous conversations that aren't so rigorous, I'm able to have really high pitch accent accuracy, I think, but I'm sure I make some mistakes. And so I think in a way there is an argument that the monitor is not useless when you're talking about Japanese pitch accent. Of course, it's not ideal. The ideal is that you fully acquire it unconsciously so that you don't have to use the monitor and your accuracy doesn't fluctuate depending on how much mental bandwidth you have. But at the same time, my pitch accent accuracy on average is higher than it would be if I didn't have a monitor, because I do have a monitor. And so, in these past couple years, I haven't got a ton of immersion, but when I do speak, I do try to consciously speak with the right pitch accent. And because of that, I've gotten pretty good at consciously making sure I speak with the right pitch accent. And, a lot of it is like, they're actually habits that just play out automatically. Like the consciously making sure that I pronounce the word with the right pitch accent itself has become a habit that plays out almost automatically, although it does still not activate if I don't have enough mental bandwidth. And so, yeah, basically what I'm saying is that although in general, Stephen Krashen would totally poo-poo the idea of relying on a monitor, I think that in the case of pitch accent, it might have some utility. But then again, I'm actually thinking now that if I wanted to fully acquire pitch accent, I should let go of the monitor, because I think the conscious analyzing and things like that might actually interrupt the natural acquisition process. So I'm still not totally clear on what I think the role of the monitor should be. Perhaps in the future, when I acquire more of pitch accent, my conclusion will be, don't worry about using a monitor. That's just going to slow down the actual acquisition process, but it is possible to actually acquire it. So do that. Who knows? Maybe that's what I'll say, or maybe I'll say use the monitor and then practice being able to turn it on and off, so that when you're immersing, your monitor is not activating, and you can still consciously be acquiring it. But then when you need to speak and you need to be accurate, you have the ability to force that accuracy in a way. Maybe that's what I'll say. I kind of have to just explore more. But that's mostly where I'm at. The last thing I'll say is that one other piece of data that I didn't have in when I made that video was that I have found a couple second language speakers of Japanese who are like Westerners who do seem to have acquired pitch accent practically fully, and I'm pretty sure they never actively studied it. What are some of their names? There's one guy in particular I'm thinking of. I'll put a video of him speaking in the description. It's not that he sounds 100% native, but if you're just looking at pitch accent, he does nail pitch accent. Now, and I've seen a couple people, maybe like 3 or 4 people who they're Westerners and they learned Japanese as an adult, and they're able to speak with virtually perfect pitch accent. Their accuracy might not be quite as high as a native, but it's close to that. And the one thing that they all have in common, all 3 or 4 of those people, is that they've lived in Japan and lived their entire life through Japanese for at least 20 years or more. So that made me realize, like, oh, well, I kind of concluded that because after 5 years of full-time immersion, I didn't acquire pitch accent, that I was never going to. But who knows? Maybe if I got 15 additional years of full-time pitch accent or full-time Japanese immersion, then I would acquire pitch accent. And that's just one of the last things that get acquired by the mind. And actually, I recently interviewed Stephen Krashen. I think that video will come out the day after this video comes out. But he was talking about how language is acquired in a certain order, and certain things that even seem to be very basic to the language are actually acquired very late in the acquisition process, and no conscious study can change the order that things are naturally acquired. So perhaps pitch accent for Westerners is just something that is acquired very late on in the process of acquiring Japanese, and I just needed more immersion. So that's a possibility I have open in my mind, but at the same time, do you really want to wait 20 years before you're able to speak Japanese with correct pitch accent? Like, even if it's possible, if it takes 20 years, that's still very less than ideal. And again, obviously it doesn't take native Japanese people 20 years, because Japanese 5-year-olds are able to speak with correct pitch accent. So it might be one of those things where, for the reasons I talked about in the original pitch accent problem video, the brains of Westerners have a kind of confirmation bias around there not being a connection between pitch and lexical meaning. And it takes a gargantuan amount of immersion for the brain to just kind of have the epiphany that that assumption is wrong. So seems like perhaps that can happen. And again, it also doesn't seem to be as much as like an on-off switch as I was talking about in that video, because there's people who have clearly acquired like half of it, but not the full thing. And there's people who seem to have acquired like 3/4 of it just based off of their accuracy. And like right now, I think I've acquired like, well, more than half, but definitely not the whole thing. So it definitely seems to be something where the brain slowly picks up on it more and more over time. It's not as much as like a you get it or you don't get it, like I thought in the when I made that pitch accent problem video. But anyway, yeah, so I guess to summarize, my thoughts as of now are that perhaps, oh yeah, and the last thing is that there also seem to be people, Westerners, who've spent 20 plus years in Japan, living their entire life through Japanese, and don't acquire pitch accent. So even if it's possible for some people after a gargantuan amount of time, it's not for everybody, so it's not a guaranteed thing. So basically, perhaps some people acquire pitch accent naturally, but it takes a gargantuan amount of immersion. We probably don't want to wait that long. My best guess right now is that if you consciously train the ability to hear pitch accent, then perhaps after that, your brain will be able to acquire pitch accent. It will probably at least acquire a lot more of pitch accent than it would otherwise, but I don't know how surefire of a thing that's going to be. And then on the other hand, there is a kind of conscious monitor you can train that can allow you to get to perfect pitch or close to perfect pitch accent in certain controlled situations, but that's going to break down whenever you're in a situation where you need to use all your brain power just to express an idea. And so that might be worth having, but it's definitely a compromise. And so what I'd say for now is, at the very least, you probably do want to train the ability to hear pitch accent. And then it's kind of up to you how far you want to take the path of training a monitor that's able to create almost perfect pitch accent in controlled circumstances, because that requires a very large amount of pitch accent study. You have to know literally every single rule and the pitch of every single word to do that. Or whether you just want to train the perception and then kind of cut it off after that point and hope that your brain will acquire a lot of it. And for people who aren't who are pretty committed to getting good at Japanese, but you're not willing to dedicate your whole life to getting a perfect accent, that second option that I just mentioned is probably going to be the best for you, because learning to be able to perceive pitch accent doesn't take very long. It's not that hard. And I've talked about how to do that in the past. So yeah, sorry for the super long answer that's kind of all over the place, but I was kind of figuring that, well, I wanted to talk about these kind of new thoughts that I was having anyway. But yeah, I've been thinking kind of a lot about, especially like writing the new site as well. I've been thinking about how, in some ways, conscious intervention does seem to improve the language acquisition process. Like, for example, memorizing the meanings of words definitely improves the speed at which you acquire vocabulary. But other ways might actually interfere. Like if you're overanalyzing the grammar too much, that might actually interfere with you acquiring the language naturally. And maybe overusing a monitor when you're trying to speak with correct pitch accent might interfere with the process of naturally acquiring it. So there's kind of some thin boundary between where conscious intervention in the language acquisition process when it stops helping and it starts actually hurting. But it's hard to draw that line and be sure about exactly where it is. And one other aspect of that is like, is it better to be consciously paying attention to the aspects of language that you want to improve at? Like, for example, paying attention to pitch accent when you're listening to Japanese? Or is it better to just get lost in the story and not be consciously paying attention to the form of the language and totally delegate that to your unconscious mind? I think it's hard to say, and I think there's certain types of conscious attention that do help, and certain types that are not going to help. And so, for example, with pitch accent, I think if you're just listening to what it sounds like in a direct way, that's going to help. Whereas if you're trying to apply a conscious overlay of your model of pitch accent onto the language, then that's probably going to get in the way. And so it's a very subtle thing, and I'm still trying to kind of figure it out myself, just pay attention to my direct experience. But yeah, that's just something that I've been kind of thinking about and exploring, and I think is something that hopefully we'll be able to learn more about as we get more detailed case studies and things like that, because it's pretty key to coming up with a plan for the optimal language acquisition strategy. So Alexandria asks, "Hi Matt, could you give some recommendations for learning meditation techniques?" Yeah, so I would personally recommend Shinzen Young's mindfulness system. It's really approachable and you can get into it really quickly, and it's worked really well for me and some of my other friends who meditate. I've also heard a lot of good things about Sam Harris's Waking Up app, although I haven't really used it myself. And also I've benefited from like meditation instructions by Sayadaw U-Tejaniya, who is a Burmese mindfulness meditation teacher. And he has a bunch of free ebooks on his website, so I'll put a link to that in the description. But yeah, those are all three of those are mindfulness-based meditation that come from Theravada Buddhism. And so there's many strands of Buddhism that have different practices that you can do. And then there's many different just spiritual traditions that have meditation practices outside of just Buddhism. So I'm most familiar with Buddhism, particularly Theravada Buddhism. So that's what I've practiced. That's what most of my friends who are into meditation have practiced. So that's what I can recommend. But there's a lot of different stuff out there. So if unless you try the stuff and it really clicks with you, then I would recommend, explore what else is out there and keep looking for something that seems to really work well for you, I guess. So Jackson Hardy asks, what do you think of the idea that your proficiency and passive vocab in your native language will correlate with how long it will take to feel fluent in your L2? For example, if two people are both learning an L2 and person A reads in their L1 and person B never reads in their L1, do you think that person B will get to a point where they feel fluent sooner? For the sake of argument, let's say each person has the exact same work ethic and time to put in, as well as any other potential variables. So here are my thoughts. So you said in the very first line of your question, do you think that the idea that your proficiency and passive vocab in your native language? So I think proficiency and passive vocab are two very different things. So first, let's talk about passive vocab. So if you're learning a language that is in the same language family as your native language, or not necessarily even the same language family, but, has genetic similarities. So at some point they originated from the same language. Then of course, having a larger passive vocabulary is going to help you because there's going to be more cognates, right? Something that I've noticed happens in languages is that there might be like a cognate between English and Spanish, and the English version is really common, but the Spanish version of that cognate is very rare, and vice versa. And so if you are, for example, someone who speaks English and you have a huge passive vocabulary and then you start learning Spanish, well, there might be some Spanish words that you're able to just very easily pick up because they're cognates, but you only know the English cognate because you had a big vocabulary, and maybe most English speakers don't know that. And not even just cognates, but also like just morphemes in the language as well, which are like components of words that have meaning. And so, yeah, if you're learning a language that belongs to the same language family as your native language, it's not hard to understand why having a bigger passive vocabulary would help you become fluent more quickly, because you're going to be able to learn words more quickly because there's going to be more cognates and more familiarity with the morphemes and things like that. So that's not too hard to understand. But if you're talking about, for example, does having a big passive vocabulary in English help you acquire Japanese? I don't think so at all. I think that's going to be completely irrelevant. So if you had two people and their overall proficiency in English is this, two native English speakers, their overall proficiency in English is the same, but one of them happens to just know way more words, and they both start learning Japanese at the same time, and they have the same work ethic and all the other variables are the same, I don't think that the person who just happens to know more English words is going to learn any faster. I mean, I can't know for sure, but I wouldn't predict that there would be any real difference. But then if you take just the general proficiency, then I could see the potential of there being some kind of like meta language ability that isn't specific to any one language, but does basically just allow you to perform better in human languages in general. So perhaps if one, there's person A and person B, they're both native English speakers, but, person A has read a ton of books, and so they just have a deep understanding of like how language is used to express concepts, and this understanding is somehow meta to the English language. It's just about like how meaning can be conveyed through like little chunks of like through words basically in general, and there's some kind of meta component of it. Then perhaps when they learn Japanese, they'll pick it up more quickly because they just have a deeper understanding of how meaning can be conveyed through words and things like that. So perhaps there is some kind of meta language ability that applies to every language that you speak, but I don't know if this is possible or not. I could see the potential of that being possible, but I just don't really know. I imagine that there probably is to a certain extent, but I don't think it would make a huge difference when you're talking about just like getting fluent in a new language from scratch. I think that would apply more for like there's after you become fluent, then how quickly are you going to be able to bridge the gap to native level, and how quickly are you going to be able to kind of like surpass native level and become a poet or a novelist in the target language? That's when that kind of meta language ability might play a bigger role. But if it's just you're trying to figure out a language from scratch that you don't understand at all, then I don't think having a really deep understanding of your native language is going to significantly help in any way. But that would just be my intuition or instinct. I can't know for sure. So Victor asks, hi Matt, in line with your recommendation to get rid of the hard button, have you thought about getting rid of the again button as well, thus eliminating any decision making while reviewing? I've been doing this for immersion-based sentence cards in Mandarin, and it's been very pleasant because A, my negative reaction to misremembering things vanished, and instead, when I don't remember things perfectly, I'm just happy to learn something. And B, I lose no time at all on cards that would otherwise become leeches. Note, I think this works best for relatively easy to remember cards. For the deck I'm trying this on, the mistakes I make tend to be because I'm making a wrong association in my mind, and shortening the interval won't really help me get rid of that wrong association. On the other hand, if I were completely forgetting words, resetting the interval would probably help. So I think this is an interesting idea, and I can totally see the potential of this working really well for people, but I haven't tried it myself, so I can't really say anything definitive on it. But I think it makes sense, especially when you're taking into account the fact that you can never fully acquire a word just through the SRS anyway. It always is going to take coming across a word a bunch of times in your immersion for you to fully acquire it. And so what you're really doing in the SRS is just making the mental dictionary entry, letting your brain know that this word exists and roughly what it means. And even if even if you're passing cards in the SRS when really maybe you should fail them, it's not like any card that you have in the SRS is ever going to be completely vanishing from your memory. Most of the time when you fail a card, it's because, there was one little aspect of that word that you forgot. It's not, but mostly you still remembered it, right? And so even if you're at that point where there's some words where you mostly remember, but you're not totally clear on exactly what it means, or, you can't remember if the last vowel in the word is this one or that one, that's not really going to prevent you from understanding your immersion. And so I could see that basically the benefit of getting rid of the decision fatigue and the negative emotions around having to fail cards might outweigh the negative of not knowing some of your cards as well as you would otherwise. So I would imagine that this probably is actually going to depend on the person. If you're the type of person who experiences a lot of negative emotions around failing cards and wastes a lot of mental energy on making decisions about how to grade cards, then for you, the benefit of removing all of that junk from the review process likely will outweigh the negative of you're not going to be learning your cards as well as you would otherwise. But for other people who have no problem just, grading most of their cards good, and then every once in a while failing a card because they didn't remember it, then probably you're better off just continuing to do that. And it wouldn't really be a big improvement. But yeah, it's basically just this balance between efficiency in the algorithm and human psychology. And so I think it's going to end up being a pretty personal thing because of that. But yeah, if anyone else tries this, then let me know what your experience is, whether it's good or bad, so that I can, update my model of how well these things work. But the other thing I will just say is that it's not like there's this thing that you hear a lot related to Anki and SRS is that, the SRS is predicting when you're going to forget things and showing you cards right before that. But when you really understand how the Anki algorithm works, it's extremely rudimentary and simple. And it's not doing anything like predicting when you're going to forget things. All it's doing is just multiplying whatever interval you last saw the card at by 2.5. And, there's a little bit more complication than that, but not very much. So, yeah, really, I don't think there's anything that magical about the intervals. It's mostly that you're just seeing it every once in a while, and that's what's making you able to remember it. And I actually have heard or read some studies quite a while ago, so I don't remember the details, but they kind of found that they were messing around with different SRS intervals, and they found that the intervals don't have to be very precise to get a really good effect, and trying to optimize the intervals makes a relatively small difference. So yeah, I think that even if you never failed cards and you just saw it every once in a while in the SRS, that would probably still give you like 90% of the benefit of having like a fully optimized algorithm, especially when we're taking into account, again, that it's not like we're trying to study for a medical exam and we need to know every piece of knowledge precisely. We're preparing for immersion, and immersion is where all the real learning happens. So as long as we're just exposing our minds to all these words and roughly what they mean, roughly what they look like, then we're going to be getting most of the benefit that there is to get anyway. So So Katie Woodhams asks, "Hi Matt, I'm thinking of taking 6 months of leave from my job at some point so that immersing in my target language, Maori, I don't know, I just assumed that that's a Japanese R. I don't know how you actually pronounce that. Maori can be my main focus for that time. Do you think that there are any points in the process where full-time immersion would be the most beneficial? At the moment, I'd say I'm at a low intermediate. My comprehension varies wildly depending on what I'm listening to / reading, but I'd say on average about 80%. Do you think I'll get more gains from all Maori all the time while I'm still building my comprehension, or later when I'm getting close to 100%, or does it not matter?" Yeah, so I thought this was a really interesting question. What point in the process is it most beneficial to be really immersing yourself as much as possible? And I would say, besides the very beginning of the process, probably, it's always going to be extremely beneficial, whether you're an intermediate learner, an advanced learner, or somebody trying to bridge the gap to native level. Oops, got my reflector thing. It's always going to be extremely beneficial to experience that all target language all the time environment. And additionally, what I'll say is that the better you get at the language, the more necessary that full-time immersion becomes to continue to improve. So for example, in my Japanese right now, I regularly spend a few hours a day in Japanese, but it feels like virtually nothing. And I don't feel like I improve at all from only spending 1 or 2 hours a day in Japanese. It feels like in order for me to really take my Japanese to the next level and start to approach native level, I would need to move to Japan and use Japanese all day, every day for a year or two. And then maybe I could catch up to native level. And so when you're really advancing your my level, it's not nice to have all Japanese all the time or all target language all the time. It's necessary to continue to improve. And the closer you are to beginner, the less this is true. Because when you're a beginner in the language, then, there's so much basically high yield things to learn. For example, when you're a real beginner in the language, learning 10 words can drastically improve your comprehension because those 10 words might show up in like every third sentence or something like that, or one of those 10 words might. And so, yeah, basically, when you're at the beginning of the process, you don't need very much immersion to improve anyway. But the other thing is that you won't have any endurance. The lower level you're at a language, the less endurance you're going to have, and the more exhausted your brain's going to become through immersing in a given language. So one way to think about it is that, like, if you're a beginner, you're not going to be able to effectively just immerse yourself in that language all day long, because after a couple hours, you're going to probably be like mostly totally fried. Now, I still think it's going to be beneficial to force yourself to continue to immerse anyway, but you're not going to be benefiting from a full immersion environment as much as you would as an intermediate learner, where you can maybe spend 6 hours a day in the language without really getting fried. And then when you're an advanced learner, you could probably spend literally all day without getting fried. And so from that sense, you could say that the higher level you're at, not only do you need it more, but you can also take better advantage of it because you won't get exhausted. You'll have the endurance to continue to really actively engage with the language learning process from the whole day basically. But I would say once you're at least an intermediate level, you're at a point where if you really push yourself, you probably can immerse all day and get those benefits. But you're probably going to be really exhausted at the end of each day, and it's going to be rough. It's going to feel like you're at boot camp getting your ass kicked. But if you're really motivated, then I think that you can do that, and that is going to lead to you improving really quickly, obviously. And that's kind of like what I was doing when I was in Japan. It was hard to go days without hearing any English at all, but I did it, and because I was really excited about the language, in a way it wasn't hard. I mean, it was exhausting, but I was able to I was very willing to do it. And so, yeah, I guess I would say from a pure efficiency standpoint, probably the better you are at the language, the more you're going to be able to take advantage of a full immersion environment, and also the more that you're going to need it. But I would say anytime after the beginner stage, you're probably going to be able to really benefit from a full immersion environment, and it's going to help you improve way faster than you would be able to otherwise. So Cole McCannon asks, "Hey Matt, do you have any advice for specifically building comprehension from a physical distance or when there's a lot of background noise? At work, we all wear masks, and it's a warehouse job, so there's tons of noise and people yelling at each other from far away. I can usually make out what people say to me in English when it's noisy, and I can understand Spanish speakers perfectly on breaks in quiet places, but during work I can't understand Spanish speakers at all, which could disadvantage me against other bilinguals when it comes to being promoted. Is this just a lack of intuition when faced with limited hearing ability, or is hearing things from a distance a separate skill that I have to build? So I would say it's probably mostly a lack of intuition when faced with limited listening ability, because I mean, even when you think about native speakers, I don't think anyone practices like hearing people at a distance that much. I think it's basically just that when you're first getting comfortable in your target language, you reach a point where you can experience full comprehension when you're in basically a perfect environment, but you have just enough listening ability to reach that perfect comprehension. And so any environmental factor that's going to make things more difficult is going to reduce your comprehension. Whereas basically like it's hard to explain. It's not actually a difficult concept. It's just hard to put into words. But basically the way that I think about it is that let's say that listening ability in the abstract, we can map from 0 to 10, and 10 is a native level speaker's listening ability. You might only need a listening ability of like 6 or 7 to perfectly understand a native speaker, or to like understand a given domain in the language when you're in an environment that is totally quiet and the other person is speaking directly to you, and one person speaking at a time, people aren't talking over each other, and so on. And so it might be that you have like a level 7 Spanish listening ability, and so in a quiet environment where you're talking to somebody one-on-one, then you can understand everything they're saying, no problem. But as soon as other factors get involved where, you know, you're talking over the phone and the connection isn't so great, or there's a lot of other noise in the room, or they're yelling at you from a distance and you can't hear the sounds as clearly, then that's enough to take a big chunk out of your comprehension. And so what you have to do is just get your comprehension from a 7 to a 9 or a 10, and then you'll naturally be able to understand even when the environment is less than ideal. And I think that basically the best way to do this is to just continue to get lots of immersion. But I have thought about before, I haven't actually practiced it that much myself in Japanese, but I have thought about potentially actively exposing yourself to low quality forms of input in order to force your brain to be able to work with less information, essentially. So one thing that could be possible is, like, I know that in Audacity, if you try to apply an equalizer to an audio file, there's different modes in the equalizer that basically limit the frequency of the sound. And there's one mode where it'll sound like a radio, like a radio with a bad signal. There's another mode it'll sound like a walkie-talkie, and another mode where it'll sound like a telephone call. And of course, it's a lot harder to hear when you like basically take out a bunch of the frequencies and you make it sound like a walkie-talkie. And so I have thought, like, what if someone made a script for MPV, for example? I don't know if this would be possible, but what if someone made a script for MPV that basically limited the range of the frequencies of the audio so that it's literally just way harder to hear and it sounds like it's way lower quality, and then you practice immersing with that, and that helps you train your ability to basically use your inferential ability to understand what's being said, even though not all the sounds are there, or significantly fewer sounds are there than usual. And another thing that you can do that I have done a little bit in Japanese and I've found helps is listen to things sped up. So like try listening to Spanish videos on like 1.5 speed or 2x speed. And that will probably kind of force your brain to get better at processing things as well. And I've talked about this before. I don't recommend listening to the language sped up if you don't already have perfect comprehension in an ideal situation. But once you have perfect comprehension in an ideal situation, then maybe you want to start purposely making things more difficult so that you can start training that, right? It's going to be a lot more efficient to train your listening. Let's say in this model, if you're still at like a 2 or a 3, so you're only understanding like half of what you're listening, it's going to be a lot more efficient for you to improve listening to 1x audio than 2x audio, even though technically you're going to be getting exposed to twice as much language when you hear 2x audio, but it's going to be less comprehensible to you, so you're going to improve more slowly. But anyway, yeah, I have thought about before making regimens where you're actively listening to things sped up, you're actively reducing the quality of the audio files that you're listening to, and perhaps that would help you improve your listening ability more quickly. And so, yeah, it's actually something I want to experiment with. I'd love to hear people's experience experimenting with these things. And again, I only recommend experiencing with these things after you have perfect comprehension in an ideal situation. But I will also say that my experience in Japanese has been that just as I immerse in high quality content, over time my listening ability gets better and better. And when I am in a situation where there's a lot of noise or a lot of people talking over each other, I'm just naturally able to hear that better. So I do think there's an aspect to it where the more you immerse, the more your listening ability gets better. And there is just a period where there's a gap between what you can understand in an ideal environment versus what you can understand in a less than ideal environment. And so if you just keep immersing, it will keep getting better. But it does make sense to me that doing some of this training that I just mentioned could speed up that process. So yeah, that's all the questions for this week. Thank you guys again so much for your questions, and I'll see you guys in the next one.